Hello everyone and welcome to another History and Myths video with RyanGB. This one is going to be more about history and less about myths, because I'm going to enter into something that not a lot of people fully understand, and is how warships fought during World War II. Now, of course, they don't understand it because they don't understand how they were built, their properties, how they actually got to fire to the enemy, what they used to aim and decide where to fire to hit something, etc. And I'm doing this because there are a lot of histories in around about ships that actually weren't that good compared with the myths that surround them. And if you don't understand how a battleship should be built, it's very hard to understand why certain battleship might not be so good as history or myths usually tend to say it was. So to begin with, what's a battleship? Well, a battleship is a heavily armored ship of the line. It's actually one of the successors to the all-time ship of the line. Armed with very big guns, usually of calibers of 11 inches upwards. The latest armored battleships had 11-inch guns. The most heavily armed ones sported 18-inch guns, the Japanese Yamatos. There were some projects on the line for 20-inch guns for some battleships, most notably the Super Yamato, the projected successor to the Yamato, and the H-44, the German battleship, which never was and was nothing but a pipe dream. But on the field they had from 18-inch to 11-inch, between those. How they were built? Well, one of the most common things and themes about battleships is that people picture them in their heads as fully armored ships. Now, that was not the case. Initially, in the first times back in the 19th century, what was done was to put over the usual wooden hull of a ship of the line a thick iron plating, which covered most, if not all, of the hull. Those were really fully armored ships, but of course the armor wasn't that good. It was enough for the artillery of the time, but as soon as rifle ammunition came around and higher penetration were achieved, well, that wasn't enough. As fully metal ships were built, as fully metal battleships instead of wooden frame with iron protection were built, ship displacement went over and over and over and increased steadily. So a point was reached where you could not fully armor the whole ship. It was a simple thing of maths. So much armor in the needed thickness to make it impervious to enemy fire was impossible in a given displacement. So what it was started to be done was to mathematically calculate and design armor arrangements to offer a high degree of protection in most areas and a very high degree of protection over critical areas. So, for instance, normal First World War battleship would have maybe a 11-12 inch belt, main belt, usually backed by sloped internal decks. And that belt would cover the waterline of the ship mostly, more or less, from the area on the front turret back to the area of the back turret. Usually the thickness was not steady as well. Usually it was tapered. For instance, most battleships had a taper of maximum thickness of maybe 11 inches, amidships tapering down to 6 inches on the extremes of the belt. That was done to protect, of course, the waterline against penetrating hits, and also because the machinery was behind that belt and under that belt. You can see it in this arrangement here. It's very easy to see that, well, the machinery, the boiler rooms, etc., is well below decks, and the belt is there to protect that against that kind of fire. The belt usually covered from slightly below the waterline up to maybe a couple feet over the waterline. Out of those areas, well, there was some armor plating. There was an upper belt, usually in battleships, 6-7 inches. There was forward of the main belt, back of the main belt. Well, there were also armor areas, maybe 4 inches of armor was usually. The superstructure was totally unarmored. The turrets were extremely armored, and the barbettes, which are the circular structures under the superfiring turrets, were also very well armored. Usually the turret armor was disposed in very thick frontal armor because it was expected that the incoming fire would be from the same direction you were firing at, and not so thick sides. Thickness of turrets varied a lot between ships of the time, but usually was at least as thick as the belt. Sometimes was thicker, but well, more or less it was in that range. And finally, the conning tower. And the conning tower was the position where the captain or the commanding officers of the ship would command the ship in battle. Now, there usually was an open bridge in any battleship where, in the day-to-day basis, well, the captain, the officers of the watch could be there and guide the ship from there. That open bridge was totally unarmored, and as soon as the fighting started, usually not all officers did, because some of them didn't like to be enclosed in a tight area, a very armored area, where they couldn't see as much as in an open bridge. Well, as soon as battle started, most officers would go into the commanding bridge, and that would be heavily armored to protect what was inside. Now, there was two different theories about command posts and command areas. Most navies decided to heavily armor it, very heavy armor, 12 to 16 inches depending on the battleship and the era, to stand against any enemy with gunfire. But there was one navy that didn't armor the bridge as much, which was ironically the Royal Navy. As time went by, they realized that a very heavily closed area, if hit by a very heavy shell, even if the hit didn't penetrate, well, the enclosed area would resonate like a massive bell, and that anyone in there would die because of the concussion. Actually, this was never proven as that. I mean, as a definitive and realistic theory, but we can say that the Prince of Wales stood a 15-inch hit on the commanding post of the battleship, which penetrated, went from side to side, didn't explode inside, and a lot of people in there were dead, of course, but some of them, including the captain of the ship, survived the hit. Meanwhile, we have the instance of the Bismarck class battle, where a 16-inch hit from Rodney hit the commanding post and killed instantly both Lutyens and Lindemann. We don't know exactly if the hit actually penetrated and exploded inside, or if it was a partial penetration, and the effect of the concussion was what actually killed them. But in any case, well, it's an interesting thing to understand, and goes on to prove that battleships are much more interesting than just a big ship with a lot of armor on it. Well, as time went by, the principles of designing battleships changed, and that was started by the United States. The USS Nevada class started sporting a class of armor which was called all or nothing. Now, all or nothing is a very interesting concept because it pretty much says that everything that's outside of the citadel or the most protected area should be unarmored at all. The only places where armor should be placed placed would be to protect critical areas. Which were critical areas? Machinery spaces, boiler spaces, weaponry spaces, magazines, turrets, barbets, commanding posts. Of course, the US Navy had heavy armor up there, and that most of the rest of the ship would have no armor. Why was that decided? Which is the thinking behind this? Well, one of the things is that in a battleship, in an all or nothing battleship, you are saving a lot of weight by not putting armor in places that are not exactly vital. So all that weight you are saving, you can put on a heavier main belt, heavier decks, heavier turrets, etc. Also, it goes with the fact that most AP cells of the time needed to hit a very solid plate of armor before arming themselves. An AP cell of the time, if hitting an armored part of the ship, would simply punch through and go through the other side without arming itself and without exploding, and that was thought as acceptable and as something that was better than having the cell armed and exploding inside the ship. So the concept was interesting enough, and it was weight saving. The Nevada was not that big displacement ship, but it was heavily armored. For the time, it was one of the best protected ships of the time. Now, as time went by, new things started becoming pretty obvious, and especially from the Battle of Jutland. And up to the Battle of Jutland, most armoring of the ships was centered around the vertical protection. That means the belts, the side armor, the turrets, etc. It was protected from cells coming from one side or the other side. Now, this made, of course, sense in a time where engagements were expected to happen at distances below 10 kilometers. It just happened that Jutland was fought mostly at distances over 10 kilometers. And over 10 kilometers, cell and artillery has a pretty nice property, and is that it arcs. It goes, it's plunging fire. It goes from up to down. You fire your guns in a high elevation, the cell goes very high and then falls over. And as a result, a lot of artillery hits during the Battle of Jutland were observed and achieved on the decks of the ship, totally bypassing the main belt. And the decks back at that time weren't particularly well armored. I mean, a normal battleship of the time would be very well armored, very well, with a couple inches of armor deck. But that wasn't nearly enough to stop cells. So after Jutland and after World War I, most designers came back to that battle, analyzed it, and realized that from then onwards they would have to put very strong decks because plunging fire was going to happen. And the improvements on fire control and artillery meant that long distance engagements were not only possible but were going to be the norm in the future. So from then on, deck armor started having a very, very, very big influence on the battleship design. Now moving on, we reach to the 1920s. During the 1920s, there was a very big diplomatic event, which was called the Washington Naval Treaty, which was later on subscribed again with some modifications in London in 1930. The Washington Treaty and the London Treaty limited the battleships to be built. It imposed what was called warship holiday, a battleship holiday. During 15 years, there will be no battleships built, other than some of them which were still building. Well, there were some arrangements down there, but the idea was that for 15 years there would be no new battleships. That happened because after World War I there was a huge naval arms race between the US, Britain and Japan. And of course after World War I people were really aware that such a naval arms race could lead to another big world war, and no one wanted that. So the Washington Naval Treaty other than putting a naval holiday on building battleships, it also specified some limits to the ship. And that's why you will read in internet and books the term treaty battleship. A treaty battleship is a battleship that was built to respect the terms of the Naval Washington Treaty. Under those terms, a battleship was any ship of any displacement with guns over 11 inches, 11 inches of caliber. It was to have a top limit of 35,000 tons standard, so the size of the battleships were frozen up to a limit, and it could not carry guns bigger than 15-inch guns. Later on, in the the third treaty, the London Treaty of 1936, there was a try to limit battleship weaponry to 14-inch guns, but there was an escalator clause for 16-inch guns because the Japanese didn't sign that treaty, and the US wanted to put 16-inch guns in their battleships in case the Japanese were going for those guns. As we know, the Japanese obviously went for very big guns, and that's why the North Carolina had 16-inch guns, while the Prince of Wales had 14-inch guns. The Prince of Wales was designed respecting the 1936 agreements. So we have a set of limits for battleships. They say 35,000 tons as the most. At the most, there's going to be a limit of weaponry, no bigger than 15-inch guns. There's going to be a limit on the, well, not a limit, but a time frame where no one is going to build a battleship. And that's why when World War II started, we have a bunch of old battleships, World War I era battleships, most of which were modernized, of course, during the time, because you couldn't build new battleships, but you could modernize them. There was, however, a totally new batch of battleships, and there was a big gap between the old battleships and the new battleships, because the new battleships, of course, came 15 years later with a lot of lessons learned, technologies that were developed, and well, as a result, the modern battleships were in general much more capable than the older ones, unless the older ones were very well modernized. There were some cases of that, like the Warspite, for instance. In general, battleship construction was kept within all or nothing parameters, but now it wasn't because it was the most efficient way to protect vital areas, but now it was because it was a way to saving weight. I mean, with a limit of 35,000 tons, you can put so much armor, weapons, and machinery. You have it was like one of those triangles when you can pull in one direction, but the other two will shrink. A compromise would be done. A battleship would have either it would be either a very good all-rounder, or it would be very heavily compromised to one area. For instance, a good instance of a very well-balanced ship would be the Prince of Wales. It was not particularly excellent at anything, but it was pretty good at everything. So yeah, and kind of a ship which was a little bit shifted towards weaponry was the North Carolinas. The North Carolinas had a respectable speed, they had very heavy weaponry, but their armor wasn't the thickest. The North Carolina weren't that well protected when compared with other contemporary battleships. Well, we move into World War II, excuse me, and post-Washington. Now, post-Washington, what happened was that we were directly going into World War II. And at that time, there was again a naval race going on. And once they got rid of the limits, well, people went totally mad. You can take a look at the Japanese, the Yamatos, 18-inch guns in a 72,000, well, it's actually 64,000 ton displacement standard, but at full load was 70,000 more or less. I mean, that was a monstrosity of a ship. with brutal armor, 20 inches in the front of the guns, impressive belt. Well, they went overboard. Another instance of a totally nuts battleship was in Montana, the U.S. Evolution of the Iowa, with 12 16 inches and an armored belt, well, armor almost as good as the Yamato's, a total monster. Now you could go and say that the more sensible ones were the British, which designed the Vanguard, and the Vanguard was nothing but a bigger Prince of Wales with 15-inch guns. Wasn't spectacularly big, but was cheaper than both two monstrosities. The Montanas were never built. The Yamatos, there were 4 projected, 2 completed, 1 transformed into an aircraft carrier, and another one cancelled. Now, by the end of World War II, it was very clear that the era of the battleship had ended. The carrier brought it to an end. In fact, it was the airplane, but the carrier, as a warship carrying planes, was the ship that really started dominating the seas during World War II, and after World War II was the new capital ship. Now, after speaking about battleships, I want to do a little insight into another class which is very misunderstood, which is the battlecruiser. Now, the battlecruiser is, for all intents and purposes, a class that should have never existed. It was a product of a very bright man, but very polemic man, Admiral Fisher, the first Lord of the Admiralty in the United Kingdom in the beginning of the 20th century. Now, Admiral Fisher had this, I don't know how to call it, but had this vision about warship design moving towards higher speeds and ships relying for survivability more in speed than in armor. So, at a time where navies of the era had very slow pre-dreadnought battleships and faster but much more lightly armored and armored cruisers, well, he said that the future was an armored cruiser with battleship guns. And that was the original concept of the battlecruiser. The battlecruiser is, in essence, a capital ship. In fact, in the Washington Naval Treaty, capital ship is the definition of any warship which carries guns bigger than 11 inches. So, battlecruisers, by definition, are capital ships in the same category as a battleship. The battlecruiser concept was interesting because, back at the time, there was a lot of theory done. There was no practical instances. There were not that many naval fights, and those that happened, well, there were very big classes, like the Tsushima one, but people, of course, had very different opinions about those battles. Some navies looked at the Tsushima battle and they decided that armor was as important as ever, while others decided that speed was more important than armor. And Admiral Fisher was the strongest proponent of the second. Now, what happened was that the British kept on building battleships, but they not only upscaled the battleship, because before 1906 a battleship was a ship with 4 big guns, a big sized medium caliber battery, and not that big. Well, after that time, there was the time of the dreadnought. It was Fisher, the one who created the dreadnought, the conception of the new modern battleship with a lot of turrets and unified caliber instead of big and medium calibers in the same warship. So at the same time as he pushed for the dreadnought, he pushed for a version of the dreadnought which was much faster but had less armor, and those were the Invincibles. Now, the Invincible was a very particular ship. It had the Invincibles and the Indefatigables. They had 12-inch guns, but a belt of 6 inches at the thickest. Now, of course, you can see 6 inches are not going to stand very well against battleship fire, and the problem with these ships was that they weren't actually expected to fire in a battle line action. But in the end, what happened was that they fought in a battle line action, Jutland, and it didn't go very well for them. Now that was the British approach. The Germans, which was at the time were in a naval arms race with the British, had to answer with something, because the British were coming with these very fast ships with very heavy weapons, and they had to answer with something. And they went with their own version of the battlecruiser. Their own version of the battlecruiser was a ship as heavily armored as a battleship, faster than a battleship, but not as fast as a British battlecruiser, but with much lighter guns. Now we can do a comparison. For instance, the Von der Tann, which was the first German battlecruiser, had a main battery of 8 11-inch guns at a time where the German battleships were being designed with 10 12-inch guns. Of course, the scale of the protection was the same. It was a faster ship than a standard battleship, but it paid for it with lighter weapons. The British, meanwhile, were betting on very heavy weapons, very fast ships, but very lightly armored. And again, we can see that the practical effect was that German battlecruisers were extremely tough and hard to sink, while British battlecruisers were blowing up all around the place. That's what happens when you don't put armor. Now, after World War I, the battlecruiser concept was mostly damned by everyone. Jutland had been a huge hit for the prestige of the battlecruiser. Before the war, they were the more glamorous ships of the Royal Navy. After the war, they were like pests. No one wanted them, but still they existed, and some of them were still in existence. Most notably, the Repulse and the Renown, and even more notably, the pride of the Royal Navy, the HMS Hood. And I'm speaking about all this stuff about battlecruisers specifically to speak about the HMS Hood. Now, the HMS Hood wasn't a battlecruiser. If you look at the armor specs of the warship, of the Warspite, which was a Queen Elizabeth battleship, which at the time was the biggest battleship on the world, 15-inch guns, very well armored, very fast. It was 25 knots fast. The Hood had exactly the same degree of protection, weakened in some areas, but in general it was a battleship class armor. It a huge, it was extremely long ship, which could make 30 knots. Now that's not a battlecruiser. I mean, a British battlecruiser was a very heavily armed, very fast ship with very light armor. A German battlecruiser was a very heavily armored ship, quite fast ship, but not lightly armed. This ship was a heavily armed ship, heavily armored ship, and fast as hell. The HMS Hood was no battlecruiser. It was called as one because back then anything that was over 25 knots and had big caliber guns was considered a battlecruiser. The HMS Hood was a battleship. It was the first fast battleship. One of the things that happened after the big warship holiday of the Washington Naval Treaty was that all warships, all battleships, were designed with very high speeds. North Carolina, top speed of 28 knots. King George, Prince of Wales, King George V, 28 knots. Bismarck, 30 knots. Littorio class, Italians, 30 knots. Yamato class battleships, 27 knots. Richelieu class, 30 knots as well. Those speeds were battlecruiser type. The thing is that in those 15 years, advancements in machinery and oil firing, etc., allowed for more powerful machinery in less heavy installations. So it was possible to put a very well armored ship, very well armed ship, and make it very fast. While in World War I, it was impossible to make a ship very fast while keeping it well armored and well armed. The first ship that was actually a battleship class armor with battleship class weapons and battlecruiser type speed was the HMS Hood. Later on, the North Carolina, the Bismarck, the Litorios, the Yamaros, they were called the fast battleships. Well, what the hell was a Hood then? The Hood was a fast battleship. It was not a battlecruiser, and that is very important because a lot of people disregard the Bismarck versus Hood fight as well. Yeah, it blew up the Hood, but it was a very old battlecruiser. Well, it was very old indeed, but it was no battlecruiser. It was a battleship. So yeah, these are little pieces I'm putting on place to elaborate on in further videos. For now, this is more than half an hour. I think we have covered enough in one video. I hope you enjoyed and learned something in this video. I hope you, well, enjoyed listening to this little history lesson. And as always, thank you very much for watching, guys, and see you later.